Are you active?
I'm not sure. Is that count? I'm not sure. Is that count?
Yeah. I was there once and I
You know,
thought,
that,
I did it.
so he was very negative.
The sound works.
Does this work?
It's just muted.
Is this work?
This works.
And this one? Yes,
Yeah,
it's
it's
working.
all live now.
Okay.
Are we done?
I think we're gonna start.
Don't shut the door. We need more people.
If you have any friends, text them right now. Come.
Yeah,
Excellent. Great point.
it doesn't take a whole lot of people to start a revolution.
Hey, good comments coming from the speaker.
Well, let me congratulate you happy few, who've managed to find your way to the best talk of CPAC. And what you're going to learn today, I think you will find fascinating, surprising, and very encouraging, because it overturns almost everything we're told, right? It overturns. We don't want to miss out on this treat, do we? It overturns almost everything you read in the mainstream media, almost everything you learn at school or at college. Because what do we know about CO2? We know that CO2 is, well, it's called carbon most of the time, isn't it, in the newspapers and the scare stories. And we know that carbon is contributing to man-made global warming, allegedly, and that it is something that we need to reduce if we possibly can by reining in industry and having various regulations and taxes. And what Dr. Craig Idso is about to explain in more detail is something truly remarkable, that almost everything we've been taught about CO2 is a lie. That CO2, far from being a dangerous thing, is good for the planet in several ways. And what I hope we're going to do today is talk, first of all, about a phenomenon called global greening. And secondly, I think we'd like to scotch at least one of the other great environmental myths of our time, that there is this thing called ocean acidification, and that somehow our marine life and our coral reefs are being dissolved by the acid seas. And there was actually Time? Some similar liberal publication that had a cover story about how ocean acidification was killing our coral reefs. And there was a girl yesterday who was here, I won't mention her name, but she belonged to a sort of distinguished family of a great American magnate from the past. And she was a true believer. She believed that the world was going to a hell of a handcart because of man's selfishness and greed. And there's a story I can tell later on about, to illustrate how desperate the environmentalists are not to have this stuff come out, because they want to keep it a secret. They don't want you to think that carbon dioxide is a good thing. So, welcome, Dr. Craig Idso.
Thank you.
Tell us a bit more about the phenomenon of, do you call it global greening?
Yeah, or the greening of the earth is a phrase. So, we can start. I don't know if we want to go back to kind of the beginning just to discuss the basic impacts of how CO2 causes a global greening. I think probably to do that, we need to first understand how CO2 impacts plants. And it does that in three different ways. So when you increase the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, it's kind of like you learned back in third grade, although it may not be taught in third grade still today. that is the fact that carbon dioxide is food for plants, right? They take CO2 in, and through the process of photosynthesis, they're able to produce the carbon to construct their tissues. And what's neat about this particular subject is that there actually are thousands of laboratory and field studies that have been conducted, a lot of them 20, 30 years ago, that show that the more CO2 you put in the air, the better plants grow. And they do that by 3 different mechanisms. Number 1 is they increase the productivity of the plant. Put extra CO2 in it, they grow bigger, they grow better. A lot of times that growth is below ground in the root system. About 2/3 of that growth is in the root system, and 1/3 above ground. But they also need less water to produce the same amount of tissues. They become what we call more water use efficient. All right? And the third thing that they do is, as the extra CO2 concentration, it lessens environmental stresses, the strength of those environmental stresses. For example, if ozone is a problem or high soil salinity, under higher CO2 concentrations, plants can grow better under those types of situations. And so it's kind of a nice, wonderful mix. It's a biospheric bonanza that's in store for us in the future as the CO2 concentration continues to rise. Now, getting to your global greening, we've had a 40% increase in carbon dioxide since the Industrial Revolution began 150 years ago. And that 40% increase is strong enough for us to already start to see some of these benefits I just told you about, that increase in productivity, plant water use efficiency, and lessening these stresses. We can actually see those things benefiting nature now. And there are several studies that have documented this phenomenon, this increasing of the greenness of the planet, as we call it, over the last several decades and more. Particularly, we have satellite studies. There are satellites that are above the Earth, measuring the reflectivity of vegetation on the planet, and you find that over the last 2 or 3 decades, there's anywhere from a 5 to a 15% increase in the vegetative productivity of the planet. And I don't know if you wanted me to show you any slides.
Yes, I would, because I think that some of us are slightly astonished that this could possibly be, that the planet could be turning green because of carbon dioxide. I think we need some visual evidence to prove that this really is happening.
Well, how's this for visual evidence right there? So what you're looking at here, this is a teaser of what you're going to see for the entire globe. But this is a plant known as devil's ivy or golden pothos that many of you probably grow in your own house or in your office. It's a very common plant. And the plant on the left was, well, both of these plants were grown under identical carbon dioxide under identical conditions except for carbon dioxide concentration. The plant on the left was grown at a concentration of 196 parts per million. Plant on the right at 752 parts per million. The current concentration of the atmosphere today is about 400 parts per million. All right. That one on the left is clearly deficient in the amount of leaf, stem, and root biomass that you can see. The left plant also represents the atmospheric conditions at the height of the last great ice age, some 22,000 years ago. That's about all the CO2 there was in the atmosphere back then. So that's how we would expect that plant to grow 22,000 years ago. The 752, that's what we expect will be the future. All right, before the end of this century, it's projected that we'll reach CO2 emissions that will raise the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to about 700, 750 parts per million. And that's what you're going to see with plants. So, there's another one with pea plants, and now I've got to skip forward just a bit. And let's show you, oh, James, we have to show them this one right here. That's a wonderful picture of trees growing. These are Elderica pine trees that I actually took this picture 30 years ago, believe it or not. The person in the photograph is my father, who was one of the very first scientists to kind of combat this whole issue and do a lot of these CO2 enrichment studies. But let's scroll down just a teeny bit here. All right, this graphic here, I'm going to come over to the screen and kind of illustrate what's happening here. This is a graph showing that the Earth's land surfaces were a net source of CO2 to the atmosphere, so the value of this line was positive up until about 1940. So you have things like deforestation going on. forests being cut down or whatever, things like that. But for whatever reason, the terrestrial vegetation of the biosphere was putting carbon back into the atmosphere. And then about 1940, things switched, and you can see it became what we call a sink. And an even greater sink with time. So it was sucking more and more CO2 carbon out from the air, and it's getting better or greater as we go, getting stronger.
So what does that mean exactly? When it's
They're measuring a lot of it with, some of this is model projections, but mostly satellite data, and also the scientists will go in and they'll go to a forest, for example, and measure the basal area of a tree trunk, for example, and they can follow that through time and see what's happening.
I'm probably being really thick here, right? So when it's a carbon sink, what does that mean exactly?
Carbon sink means that it's sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Right.
A source is it's emitting CO2 back to the atmosphere.
Right.
So if you grow a tree, you're going to be pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. If you cut down a tree, that tree will eventually decay over time and put all that carbon that was locked up in its tissues will eventually go back into the
So
atmosphere.
it was deforestation up until, yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of natural ecosystems were taken out of, or put into agricultural production. A lot of that happened. So this particular graphic now is adding in the oceans as well. And what you see here is that over the last 50 years, from basically 1959 to 2010, the Earth has basically doubled its carbon uptake over this time period, both the lands and adding in the oceans here, from about 2.5 to 5 billion tons of carbon per year. And then this slide here, I ought to go to make it presentation view so you can see it a little bit better. This is a measure of vegetative productivity. It's the leaf area index. And this particular group of scientists, they noted this great increase that's been happening over the last several decades from 1982 to 2009. And they actually showed that the relative change in this factor of vegetative growth due to CO2 fertilization, or that 40% increase in CO2, well, it's not quite 40 because we're only looking since 1982. But the increase in CO2 over this period, how has that affected this measure of vegetative growth? And as you can see, the key point to note is, you look on here, most of these colors are the greens, the blues, and the violets, right? Representing positive stimulation in vegetative growth. There's very few values that are red or yellow. And the significance of that is this. What it means is this. You think about what you've read in the papers and on the news and so forth, everything that you've heard about the biosphere over this time period since 1982. They will tell you what? They will say this is a period of unprecedented global warming. The temperatures are just higher than they've ever been, they'll tell you, over the last 2,000 years or more. They'll tell you that we've had massive droughts. We have had 2 super El Niños, right? We're just ending one that just occurred the last couple of years. We have had large forest fires, deforestation, war, all sorts of things that should be negatively impacting global vegetation. But, is it? Or is it the climate Armageddon, so to speak? Is that really causing a problem? And what you see here is that it's not. Overall, in the mean, there are exceptions in little places where deforestation is a problem, but the Earth's vegetation is in a far better place right now than it has been since we've been able to measure it. And that is largely due to the extra CO2 concentration, all of the emissions of fossil fuels that mankind or society has put back.
So I've read that the area that has been greened since 1982, which is when the satellite records began, the area that's been greened is the equivalent to a continent. Is that much?
I don't know. It would depend upon what you have on the continent. Is it grasslands?
But it's a lot, isn't it?
It's a lot. Yeah, you're talking net primary productivity is 6 to 15% just over the last 30 years. But again, it's significant. I could show you a couple of slides that look back over a longer period of time, and some repeat photographs if you'd like to see those.
Definitely.
All right, we'll pull them up here. So these are some of my favorite photographs that I like to use. And I often use these to demonstrate that benefit of water use efficiency. As I mentioned, one of those major benefits of atmospheric CO2 enrichment is plants need less water to produce the same amount of tissue. So when you have a region of the globe that is water limiting and hot, because it also, extra CO2 helps to ameliorate that negative influence of hot temperatures. So if you have a region of the globe like that, which is kind of, it's where I live, Arizona, I'm from Arizona, hot, dry, and we would expect that that 40% rise in CO2, that's where you're going to see some of these benefits first occurring on the globe. And indeed we have. This photograph right here was taken in 1893 by a group that went to, they were contracted by Congress to go and put these monuments all across that border between the United States and Mexico. And they would snap a picture to prove that they did indeed erect these monuments. And someone went back about 100 years later and rephotographed them all across, you know, that 1,000-mile border or whatever it is. And it's wonderful. What you see is that, you know, places like this that had no vegetation growing, it couldn't sustain vegetation. Too hot, too dry. 100 years later, now the most large, boast large populations of various plants, mesquite, ortigo, mimosa, and so forth. And it's not just there, like I said, that's happening. I can point to a couple other regions of the globe, and this one here comes from Utah, taken in 1901. There's only one lone juniper by that tree you can see, and then a few trees off in the background. And this photograph was taken at exactly the same place. There's no trickery going on here. There was a particular monument or something like that the person taking the photograph was at. And you can see these trees have expanded their range downward. You know, they're able to subsist down where they couldn't before.
Do you think there's any correlation between the amount of gin that is produced now? There's a lot more gin around, isn't there, these days than there was back then?
I guess. Got a question back there.
Yeah, how do you know CO2 is the only variable?
It's not always the only variable. That's a great question. A lot of times, CO2 is the only thing that can explain this. So we're finding this phenomenon happening on every continent of the globe where trees grow. So Antarctica is the only place where this is not happening. And in most instances, CO2 is the only thing that can explain it. Because you can't account for climate change. Because we're talking only the last 100 years. And a lot of times there's good temperature records and precipitation records that you can account for. And also, there's other things like grazing and so forth that can make a difference as well.
What about water vapor? What about water vapor?
Water vapor, that would be kind of a measure of precipitation. You can use that as an analog as
No
well.
change?
No, pretty much not. That's correct. This particular study, for example, came from Central Oregon. These are satellite photos they looked at, not satellite, sorry, aerial reconnaissance photos. And it was an area in Central Oregon, and these particular scientists actually did. They looked at everything possible that could explain this change. It was kind of in a little island area where two rivers kind of went around it, so there was no grazing, there was nothing like that. It was in a complete natural environment. And so this is what we see, especially in these places where we know that there is no other influence that could explain this. You can see the density of these trees has increased considerably over this time period. And then we have lots of other measures. I'll just show you this and then we'll go back to James for another question. But this is showing you water use efficiency values for Douglas fir and ponderosa pine trees since 1850. And we can actually get these measurements that scientists will core these tree rings and they can get a measure of water use efficiency over this time period. Not only water use efficiency, but here's an estimation of the mass, the basal area index. And as again, what you see that, you know, basically when the emissions of CO2 in the atmosphere really began to take off, which is after World War II, that's when you really begin to see the uptick in water use efficiency. Same thing with basal area index. You know, you have this fluctuation from year to year because you have temperature and you do have precipitation and other factors that are influencing growth. So you have that variability, but if you drew a trend line through here, you would see that it's increasing with time. Again, the researchers, we acknowledge that prominent effect of atmospheric CO2 enrichment.
So just for the benefit of our newcomers, we're talking about how there has been a remarkable greening of the planet caused by what the environmentalists tell us is public enemy number one, which is carbon dioxide, or carbon, as they prefer to call it, because carbon is black and evil and scary, whereas carbon dioxide is just a trace gas.
Do you know that our breathing in here right now, are we raising the CO2 concentration above what it normally would be? Are you worried?
Should I be? Tell me, you're the scientist.
You shouldn't be. You know, in fact, it's really true. We can actually respire in closed areas like this where there's not much exchange with the atmosphere. And we can raise the CO2 concentration above that 400 parts per million background. We can get it, I measured it in classrooms with middle schools. You know, a classroom like this size with 30 middle schoolers in, we can get a CO2 concentration of 1,000 parts per million. And of course, there's no major health effects. When we respire CO2, you're talking about 40,000 parts per million is coming out of our breath. In order to cause any harm to human physiology, it needs to be about 15,000 parts per million. So that, at that point, you might get a headache, you might feel a little dizzy, but it will never cause any harm to us unless you're standing next to a volcano and it's spewing out a higher concentration of CO2. But that's the last
You'll
of
have
the
other
worries.
worries as well
Yes.
besides the CO2.
Correct.
Won't you?
That's right.
And so if we burn all the fossil fuels on the planet, which of course environmentalists say we shouldn't, we should leave them in the ground. But suppose we did, suppose we ignored them.
Yeah, if that happened, we'd only get a CO2 concentration of somewhere between 1 and 2,000 parts per million. So maybe 1,200, 1,500, something like that. So it will never be a problem. And the wonderful good news about that is, I have another slide, James, let me see if I can pull it up here. And that is this. These benefits, these productivity benefits that I talked about, they increase for they increase far beyond a doubling of atmospheric CO2. So what you're looking at here is the percent growth enhancement as the CO2 concentration rises above ambient, or above ambient meaning what it is now. So it's 400 parts per million right now. If we added 300, it would be at 700 parts per million. And this is these data points represent actually an amalgamation of hundreds of studies. And what it shows you that for a nominal doubling of CO2, we expect about a 35% increase in biomass. And that increase continues out all along that worrisome range of how far we can, or how high we can get that CO2 concentration up if we burned all fossil fuels. So positive growth benefits that entire range.
So I've written about this occasionally, and I've always been a Breitbart, and I've always been very impressed by how much traffic you get, how much people respond to this. Because I think people are very surprised to hear this. I mean, most of us here have probably learned about photosynthesis at school, and yet at the same time, I don't think many of us made the connection that CO2 levels, we know it's plant food, and yet we can't quite visualize it to the extent that you've just shown us. Why do you think this, I'll mention my story in a bit, but what's your theory on why it is that this good news has not been more widely publicized?
There's probably 100 different reasons one could point to. I think certainly, you know, in the news media, we all know if it bleeds, it leads, right? If it's not alarmism, it doesn't sell, and that sort of thing. So they tend to ignore it from that perspective. But, you know, also it's, you know, we would be naive to say that it didn't have a political component here, and that politics comes to play, and we don't hear this because of that reason. I often visit with scientists, and a lot of them are scientists in academia, a lot of them are, and even in government, they're afraid to talk out about this for fear of their job, for fear of reprisal, for fear of not being able to publish research and so on.
Well, have you, I haven't asked you this before, have you suffered personally or professionally as a result of your...
I've had some death threats, but...
Is that all?
You have too.
Yeah, sure. Well, we all have. I think everyone who's a climate skeptic of any kind has suffered vilification and...
Yeah,
tell us more about your death threats and things. What's happened?
Well, you know, they just tell you should go off of yourself and that sort of thing. They're very careful how they say it because they don't want the FBI knocking on their door. It's always, you should go off yourself, and that sort of thing. But, you know what? It would be hard to publish myself. I mean, there's no way I would get an academic job if I wanted to today. They would not hire me because of who I am and because of the position that I take on this issue. And in fact, I would have difficulty publishing papers. Now, I have published in peer-reviewed scientific literature, but my avenue now is I have my own website, my own nonprofit organization. I started it many, many years ago when I realized that that would be the best avenue for me to get this message out.
But presumably what they do is they say, well, this guy is not peer reviewed. He's just an outsider.
But I am peer reviewed, but I still may be an outsider because I don't believe.
But it's quite difficult finding journals prepared to publish this.
It is. It's kind of a just a restricted club, so to speak.
And you mentioned to me before how you got into this game. Tell us about that.
So, how long do you think this issue's been going on for? 5, 10 years, 20, 30? We said 30. Yeah. Yeah, it's been going on for a considerable amount of time. So I showed you a picture earlier of my father. He was actually one of the very first scientists to speak out on this issue in the 1970s. If you remember, Newsweek ran a cover, I think it's 75 or 76, where they show the Earth in an icebox, basically, as the coming ice age was coming. Well, it wasn't, the underpinnings had already begun for global warming at that time, and the models had started to come out. And my father wrote his first paper on this subject that was published in Science magazine in 1978. And so for years, I grew up with this whole debate. And I watched him as he'd go and give his talks, and wasn't quite vilified as I probably would be today, or some of us are vilified today. It was much more kept within scientific confines there. It was much more a scientific issue. But I watched him do that, and then over the years he kind of shifted more from the climatological side of the debate to the biological side of the debate, which we're pretty much talking about here today. And he wrote a couple of books demonstrating some of these benefits. One in, I think, 1984, and the second one came out in 1988 or 89. And that second book then was picked up by a group that really liked the benefits. They wanted to get this message out, so they produced a short 30-minute video and gave it to all the members of Congress. And that's when it caught the attention of then Senator Al Gore, who, as we all know, was the man who wanted to be the environmental president. And he set up a subcommittee hearing in the Senate where he brought my father up to testify and share this point of view. And in fact, when my father heard about this, he worked for the Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Water Conservation Laboratory in Phoenix. And when he was asked to come testify, he first said, well, what's the committee? Who's going to be doing this? And the word got back down, well, it's Al Gore. And he said, no, I'm not going. Because they knew what he was going to get into. And then basically their office calls his office and says, you are coming or we will subpoena you to come. And so he ended up going ahead. He didn't let it get to a subpoena and went in. And it was pretty much a stacked game. It was him versus Gore's, I think, 4 people that were picked to the other side. And raked him over the coals and said some things that were not nice. And I was in college at the time and watched what had happened. And I had aspirations to work for the U.S. government and do some of the things that, do some of this research, continue that. But when I saw that, I realized that that would not be the wisest decision or move to make, and went out on my own.
It's fascinating to hear that your father fell foul of Al Gore, because he's certainly not the only one. Are any of you familiar with the story about Roger Revelle? Roger Revelle was the guy who taught Al Gore, and when he made his Inconvenient Truth documentary, Al Gore sung the praises of Roger Revelle and said he was the guy who turned him on to all this. And shortly before he died, Roger Revelle wrote a book with Fred Singer, another evil climate change denier, so-called. And in this paper, they said, we do not believe that CO2 represents a serious problem. It's not causing catastrophic man-made global warming. It's not a big deal. And Al Gore's response was to try and suggest, and he rang up Ted Koppel. He rang up Ted Koppel and asked him to intervene in this. And Ted Koppel was appalled being asked to do this by Al Gore, saying, like, you should be above all this political behaviour. And Gore sought to discredit his old teacher by saying that he'd gone senile when he wrote this paper. I mean, he's very, very dodgy. I can say this to this audience, but you understand. But if we were telling this stuff to a liberal audience, they would think that you were making this stuff up and that you'd somehow fake those photographs or that it wasn't CO2. Because, I mean, CO2 has been demonized, hasn't it?
Yeah, it sure has. Sure has. Sorry, not much more to add to that one.
No. Well, I think we should talk about another area of mutual interest. You've all heard about the phenomenon of ocean acidification, haven't you? You know our coral reefs are dissolving because of the waters are allegedly acidifying. So perhaps I could ask Dr. Itzo to tell us, is this true? Should we worry about our coral reefs?
Well, let me see if I can find a quote here. This is the twin evil of global warming. All right, it's how it goes like this. Let me see if I can pull up this slide here. So, what we have here is that higher atmospheric CO2, you're looking at the bottom half of the slide here. Higher atmospheric CO2 concentrations is postulated. It's going to dissolve into the waters of the oceans, and then it's going to lower the pH there, and it's going to, which then has its own attendant sort of or suite of catastrophes, where it's going to reduce calcification rates, also cause trouble for metabolism and various other aspects of growth and development.
That's their theory.
Yeah, that's the theory. That's the theory. And here's kind of to put this kind of in perspective once again. The historical record of this is pH values of the ocean. Again, they're supposed to change as the CO2 concentration rises. It's supposed to drop. So the historical record is assumed to be about zero, at zero. Relative, this is the decline relative from what it used to be.
Is CO2 acidic?
It is.
Right.
It is.
And when it gets dissolved in...
Yes. Now the oceans itself actually has a pH value that ranges depending on where you're at, but we could call the average about 8.1. That's the pH, about 8.1. All right, so it's not actually acidic, it's basic, because a pH of 7, if you remember your chemistry back in grammar school, pH of 7 is neutral. Anything below that is acidic, anything above that is basic. So the ocean is at 8.1. It's hypothesized that 40% increase in CO2 has caused the pH of the oceans to drop 0.1 pH. That's where we are in the green line for present day. And then as the CO2 concentration rises again, they suggest it's going to go anywhere from 0.2 down to 0.5 decline. And again, have those negative effects on coral calcification, metabolism, fertility of these various marine organisms and their survival and growth. And I love it. We get quotes like this, from Stanford researchers. By mid-century, if we continue emitting carbon dioxide the way we have been, entire vast areas of both the Southern Ocean, the Arctic Ocean will be so corrosive it will cause seashells to dissolve. We're really in the last decades of coral reefs on this planet for the next million years, and so on. We're moving from a world of rich biological diversity into essentially a world of weeds.
Can I just ask you something there? Being English, I'm not familiar with your university system. I'm presuming that Stanford is not known as a very good university. I mean, no reputable scientific researcher from a decent establishment would. Stanford, is it important?
That's the big one. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder, I guess. But, same thing down in Australia. This is a famous scientist down there, or infamous maybe, who has made some very alarmist statements about what's going to happen to coral reefs, claiming that we only have about 20 to 30 years, and this was said almost 10 years ago by him. So, predictions are just way overblown as usual. And that's actually how it happens in this debate. You always get the scare story comes out, the worry, the alarm, and it actually will take, it'll take a good decade or more for the research to catch up to it, to prove it right or wrong. So these guys got away for a decade making these claims before the hard science was able to actually catch up and show that, you know what, it's way overblown, just like global warming. It's not going to be a problem in most instances.
Where do they get their funding?
Government funding. That's where the vast majority of this comes from. And then also from private foundations. Most of the foundations in the United States the private foundations are funded by liberals. They have a liberal bent. I would say it's, this is my own estimate, 95% of all private foundations are liberal. I can tell you that because I've tried to get money from a lot of them to do my own research and they won't fund. But so anyway, here's the general flaws that I've seen through my research over the years with this ocean acidification hypothesis. The first is that they tend to, when they do these experiments, they tend to use unrealistic future pH values. So, I showed you that we only expect anywhere from a 0.1 to a 0.3 or 4 decline in pH. Well, they'll conduct these experiments on these organisms in the laboratory, and they'll use values of maybe 0.5 or 0.6 or 0.7, far below than what's ever going to happen. And it's, the decline is probably only going to be about 0.2, maybe 0.3. But they'll choose these far lower values to get, which are, it's stacking the deck to get a negative result. Second, these experiments often are shock and awe. So what they'll do is they'll take an organism that's been living and accustomed to a certain pH, and they'll drop it in or quickly put it into a value that's much lower, and then see what happens. Well, without allowing for that time for the organism to acclimate. But even in that, if it acclimates, it never had the chance to actually grow and develop in that environment. And so that's another problem. The third problem is there's an unrealistic diurnal change. So what that means is this. So over the course of a day on an ocean, I could show graphs if you're interested on this, but the pH value changes over the course of a day as the tides go in and out and so forth. As the sun shines and you get more photosynthesis, it counteracts and counterbalances the decline in pH. So you can have swings in pH over the course of a day that are far larger than what we're predicting is going to occur over the next century. And these organisms survive just fine, But anyway, in the laboratory, they don't vary it like that according to the day. It's a constant value that they're looking at. So that's another unrealistic problem with their experiments. And then in short term, a lot of these are short-term experiments. They ignore the ability of organisms to adapt and microevolution. And I love this last term. It's something called transgenerational plasticity. It's kind of a new term in science that at least in this field, that's come up over the last couple of years. What that basically says that you can take, let's say you have a fish that they do an experiment on and they put in a lower pH, and that fish has a negative response. It does slowly decay or die or whatever, but its offspring, however, can survive. And that's that it's able to somehow pass transgenerationally, that ability, that plasticity, the ability to adapt from one generation over to the next. And again, these are short-term experiments. They don't, it's not taking into account the fact that this decline, if it occurs, is going to be taking place over multiple decades.
Do you come across many papers warning of the threat of ocean acidification?
Oh, by far. It still is. Right now, it's probably the topic that is discussed the most in terms of the negative potential out there.
Really?
Yeah.
So if you're...
But it's getting better. There's more and more research coming out that's showing that it's a non-problem. See, and it's also a publication bias. I think I've got at the very bottom, there's a publication bias involved here as well. So if you run an experiment and show that, this particular virus didn't have an adverse response to CO2, you may not get that published in the literature. In fact, you're probably not going to get it published in the literature. About a year ago, one of the journals came out and published a whole bunch of experiments like that showed that there was no response or positive responses, and they caught a lot of flack for it. And the editor of that volume came out and said, I'm doing this for this reason. These types of studies don't get published. And so we really are not getting the full picture when those non-negative responses aren't being seen.
So partly it's the chasing after funding, and it's more eye-catching if it's scary.
Yeah.
What about the bigger picture? Why do you think it is? I know I've got my own theory on this, but I'll mention in a moment. But why do you think it is that CO2 is being demonized in this way?
Well, I often say I think it's a combination of reasons. It's different people latch onto this issue for different reasons, right? If you're a scientist and you know, your livelihood contingents upon whether or not you can publish, and also if you're publishing, you're getting research dollars to support, you know, yourself and your family. So if you come out and say global warming is not a problem, you're not getting a research grant, and you're in trouble, you know, personally and professionally. But then you have other groups, other organizations latch onto this issue. Politicians love it, because if you can control carbon, you can control life. You know, we're often described in the most basic of forms as carbon-based life forms, aren't we? You can control life if you can control CO2. The UN loves it because they are tired of the United States saying, we're not going to pay you money, we're not going to give you some of our money unless you do this or that. Well, if they could just tax carbon globally and provide an independent source of their funding, wow, they would love that. You know, the Cold War is no longer here, and this issue just fit perfectly for them. So it's an onion for different people. You know, you pull off one layer and you find another.
I totally agree with that. I also think there's another element to this. I think it's quite interesting that the studies suggesting that ocean acidification might be a problem started appearing just as man-made global warming's theory started to look shaky.
You think there's a correlation there?
I think there may be a correlation there, because as we've talked about in other discussions earlier in yesterday, there's a massive industry, a massive global industry riding on CO2 being a problem. If CO2 is not a problem, then that means a lot of people are suddenly out of pocket. You think about the entire renewables industry, for example. That is entirely predicated. Well, it's predicated on peak oil being a problem, which it isn't now. So that excuse is gone. So what you have left is we must have renewable energy to stop the planet doing all the terrible things that are going to happen to it because of our selfishness and greed and CO2. If CO2 is not a problem, then let's frack, baby, frack, because fossil fuels are obviously a more efficient way of producing energy. And so ocean acidification was what I call the Siegfried line of the climate alarmists. So that in the Second World War, as I'm sure you keen students of military history will know, the final redoubt of the Germans was the Siegfried line. So when they'd been defeated on every other field, they could retreat behind the dragon's teeth of the Siegfried line, and you Americans had to fight them in the Schutzgun forest and places like that, and it got very, very nasty. And so ocean acidification is their final redoubt, and if that goes, they've really got nothing left. Which is why, to return to an earlier theme, people like Dr. Itso get death threats, why scientists involved in the whole field of skepticism get vilified and character assassinated and denied tenure and denied publication in peer-reviewed journals.
It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and the scientific organizations, I got an email from one organization that I am a member of, I won't name it, but they claimed, they came out and the heads of the organization said that they're going to be involved in this march for, I forget what it is, but basically it's an Earth Day thing where they're now marching with it, you know, showing their allegiance with the climate alarmist point of view. You know, that they know that's where the money is, that's where they're going to stay. You know, but it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's going to take a long time to root this out. So,
well, I found that fascinating. I hope you all did. Would anyone like to ask any questions?
What were CO2 levels when corals and shellfish evolved?
yeah, that would have been about 500, you know, and I'm not a geologist, but from what I remember from the dates, it would be about 500, 600 million years ago. And CO2 concentrations back then were anywhere from 5 to 10 times higher than they are today. So corals actually evolved under a higher CO2 concentration.
So under her theory, shouldn't they have dissolved rather than evolved?
Yes. And we can get into the caveats that they'll complain about it's the rate of rise and that sort of thing. But yeah, it makes a great point that You know, this is when they actually came into being. So, you know, logically, one would assume that they have the genetic ability to survive and adapt and cope in that type of environment. And it was much hotter back then too. So.
We've just been warned, we've got 5 more minutes, so if anyone's got any other questions, let's make them quick and make everything snappy. Okay.
Yeah, I understand the Daily Mail reported recently that NOAA was called out for cooking the books. There was a paper that was supposed to debunk the pause, and as it turns out, there really is a pause. And since there's a science march that's scheduled, I'm wondering why don't you see more protests against the people who are manipulating scientific data?
You know, the manipulation of data, I don't know why we don't have more people standing up, but I'll address the manipulation of data. I've actually looked into this, and Tony Heller right here, he could talk to you afterwards and share with you a lot of information about that. He's done a lot of studies into it. I did a study many years ago, around 2000, I published in a peer-reviewed journal that showed that some of these changes were happening, where they were introducing spurious warming trends into the data, you know, as early as 2000, you know, 1999, 2000. So this is, I mean, to us who've been involved in this game, it's nothing new. It doesn't really arouse us that much when these things happen anymore because they're commonplace. They happen all the time, these shenanigans.
We've got, I think, for one more question, I think. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Itzo, for coming. My question has to do with, you said there's a conflict of interest when it comes to grant funding for climate research. How far does that extend beyond climate research? You mentioned specifically that climate research is problematic with the grant funding, but you know, how many scientists do you believe exaggerate their findings just to get more grants?
You know, the great person to talk about that is actually Pat Michaels with the Cato Institute. He's done a lot of studies on this, and my understanding from the little bit of research that I've seen that he's produced is that there is this publication bias that exists, not just in the climate change area, but across all disciplines. And you can also find that you have a better chance of getting published, not only if you use alarmist terms, but they found that if you include a US scientist as an author, a co-author, that will also increase your chances of getting published. So, you know, this bias exists in numerous forms.
Thank you very much, Dr. Craig Itzo, for that enlightening session. I hope you all
Thank you
enjoyed
for
it.
coming. Appreciate it.